During the 3 centuries from the 15th to the 18th century, Europe gradually emerged from the profound darkness of the Middle Ages into Enlightenment. This was an era of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the great geographical discoveries, marking unprecedented advancements in human civilization and science. Regrettably, in such an age of cultural progress and intellectual awakening, Europe witnessed a bizarre and bloody witch hunt. In this movement, millions of innocent people, especially women, were wrongly identified as witches, and tragically met their end on the stake or the guillotine. In the UK, some professors suggest that today's understanding of witchcraft may have its roots in the Druid religion practiced by the ancient Celts. Historical records indicate that Druid followers once used the gravely ill as sacrifices, given their strong belief in the eternity of the soul. During the battles where the Celts resisted the Roman Empire, Druids in black robes often walked the battlefield, loudly cursing the Roman soldiers. Such rituals and behaviors easily led outsiders to associate them with witchcraft. Subsequently, as Christianity gradually rose and prevailed in Europe, perceptions of witchcraft underwent a transformation. In Christian beliefs, God represents the absolute good, while Satan is the origin of all evil. Just as priests were seen as messengers of God on earth, witches were deemed agents of Satan. Therefore, all misfortunes and calamities, such as death, diseases, and wars, were attributed to the malevolent powers Satan wielded through witches in the mortal realm. In essence, under the strong influence of Christianity, witches became closely linked to the wickedness of Satan, representing the embodiment of evil. This entrenched perception acted as a driving force, triggering a witch-hunting craze that swept across various European countries, leading to the tragic fate of millions of innocent people. Given the relatively lower social status of women at the time, they unfortunately became the primary victims in this brutal campaign. According to subsequent statistics, in France and Germany, of those accused and persecuted as witches, 80% were women. In England, this number was even higher, exceeding 90%. This was not unrelated to the pronouncements of the clergy in their sermons, who often proclaimed, "Women should bear responsibility for the original sin, and women play a significant role in the misfortunes of men." Hence, in medieval Europe, simply being born female made them associated with original sin, making them more susceptible to accusations of witchcraft. Surprisingly, the peak of the European witch hunts did not occur during the so-called Dark Ages, but rather between the 15th and 17th centuries. This period marked a time of social transformation in Europe, witnessing the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the rise of nationalism. It symbolized Europe's shift from ignorance to civilization. There were multiple factors driving the height of the witch hunts, with one of the most significant being the Black Death that swept across Europe. This pandemic killed about a third of Europe's population and had profound impacts on the societal structure of the time. To maintain its influence, the Catholic Church sought a suitable scapegoat during this great plague. They capitalized on the public's panic over the Black Death, claiming witches were the instigators of this catastrophe. Under the Church's instigation, especially under the pervasive threat of death, the ordinary Europeans desperately needed a vent for their frustrations. As a result, women, particularly those with lower social status, became the primary victims of this intense persecution. On the other hand, between the 15th and 17th centuries, Europe was at a turning point, transitioning from the Middle Ages to the early modern period. The medieval order was gradually collapsing, religious tensions were intensifying, and wars between nations erupted repeatedly. Against this tumultuous social backdrop, interpersonal trust was severely undermined, as never seen before. A pervasive sense of insecurity and mistrust meant that when unforeseen events or disasters occurred, people were quick to cast doubts on others, frivolously branding them as witches. Moreover, as the saying goes, the darkest hour is just before the dawn. During the growing pains of the Renaissance and the Reformation, the control and oppression by both the Catholic and Protestant churches, as well as their internal conflicts, peaked. It was as if they were making their last desperate stand before their decline. Thus, due to a combination of various factors, the 15th to 17th centuries which should have been a period of human liberation and the onset of modern civilization, paradoxically became the zenith of the witch-hunting movement. Before the 15th century, Europe's persecution and crackdown on witches was not a widespread or systematic practice but rather consisted of sporadic and localized incidents. For instance, in the 9th century, when the Frankish king Louis was bedridden due to illness, his offspring Lothair I captured a nun by the Saône River, wrongfully accusing her of witchcraft, and eventually decided to end her life by drowning. Similarly, after the sudden death of East Frankish Emperor Arnulf, a man and a woman, both alleged witches, were quickly arrested, and after severe interrogations, they too met their demise. By 1028, when the Count of Augurum fell ill, he hastily identified a woman and her accomplice, accused them of being wicked witches, and chose burning at the stake as their method of execution. Before the 15th century, persecutions of witches or sorcerers in Europe did occasionally occur, but they were mostly isolated cases. It wasn't until the 15th century that professional books on persecuting witches began to emerge. For instance, Formicarius, written by Johannes Nider, mainly focused on how to identify, judge, and execute witches. This book reflected the societal fear and superstition surrounding witches during that time. During this period, the most notable victim of the witch hunt was undoubtedly Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, from France. Against the backdrop of the 100 Years' War between England and France, Joan's valiant battles shifted the fate of France and broke the military dominance of England. However, sadly, she was captured by the Burgundian army in the later stages of the war and was sold to the English. Despite her courageous sacrifices for her country, the English, after a series of religious trials, condemned her as a witch and decided to end her life by burning her at the stake. But it was Pope Innocent VIII who truly made the persecution of witches a systematic action. In 1484, Innocent VIII issued the papal bull, Summis Desiderans Effectibus, which marked the beginning of Europe's witch hunts. In 1487, two inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, co-authored Malleus Maleficarum, translated as The Hammer of Witches. The book not only enumerated methods to identify witches but also detailed how to prosecute them. It became the theoretical guide for the witch hunts. Between 1487 and 1669, Malleus Maleficarum was reprinted as many as 29 times. Until the 17th century, this book remained the fundamental manual for hunting witches. The success and widespread influence of Malleus Maleficarum attracted numerous scholars to the theoretical study of witch hunting. Among them, Jean Bodin, a renowned French thinker and the founder of modern bourgeois sovereignty theory, clearly expressed his position in his work De la Démonomanie des Sorcières, often translated as On the Demon Mania of Witches. In order to appease the wrath of God, to gain God's blessings, to increase the fear of God, to protect people from the harm of some, to safeguard the well-being of the virtuous, and to punish the most detestable sin one can imagine, these witches must be shown no mercy. The attitude of such a progressive and enlightened scholar towards witches gives an idea of the overall societal atmosphere of the time. Under the guidance of Malleus Maleficarum and other related works, combined with years of witch-hunting practice, people gradually developed a set of criteria and methods for identifying and judging witches. It was believed that witches, having made a pact with the devil, would have lighter bodies than ordinary people. Therefore, if a person suspected of being a witch was thrown into water and floated, they were considered a witch. Additionally, people believed that witches had physical characteristics that differed from ordinary individuals. For instance, if a woman had large birthmarks, moles, had prominent canine teeth, or extra fingers, she might be marked as a witch. Even more bizarrely, if the weight of a suspected woman exceeded that mentioned in the Bible, she could also be deemed a witch. According to records, in 1646, there was a standard for identifying witches: an elderly woman with a face full of wrinkles, long eyebrows, fine hair on her lips, a sharp voice, holding a cane, wearing a wrinkled coat, and keeping a cat or dog nearby, can be directly declared as a witch. Under these arbitrary and capricious standards, there was almost no chance of survival once someone was accused of being a witch. Moreover, the identification and trials of witches by religious courts were even more absurd. Interrogators would strip the witch naked, searching for moles or birthmarks on their bodies, and then use needles to pierce those spots. If the woman screamed or bled, it was considered proof of her association with the devil. If she denied being a witch, the religious court would resort to various forms of torture, and most people couldn't endure the torment and would confess to the alleged crimes. During that dark period, it only took a few words to easily accuse someone, especially women, of being witches. This led to many people making arbitrary accusations and framing others out of jealousy, revenge, or a desire to find scapegoats. Informing on others became a widespread phenomenon. For instance, in 1576, approximately more than 3,000 people suffered dire consequences due to accusations of witchcraft, which originated from a person named Trua Escher. Because the trials of witches often involved stripping them of their clothes, for many, including clergy members, it was a prime opportunity to appreciate, toy with, and exploit women. Executing witches resembled an erotic spectacle of a circus, drawing crowds every time, and it was particularly satisfying for those men. The witches' naked bodies, their expressions of agony, and their screams provided them with immense sexual gratification. What the inquisitors of those religious tribunals could gain was even more. They would confiscate all the property of those sentenced as witches as their reward for the trials, making the persecution of witches not only a means to consolidate church power but also a significant avenue for enriching themselves. Driven by various temptations, interests, and misguided beliefs, an increasing number of innocent individuals were drawn into this. The following horrifying statistics reflect the bloody and brutal nature of this witch hunting that spanned 3 centuries. From 1560 to 1680, in Essex County, England alone, 91 witches were executed, with 68 of them being women. In the small German town of Wiesensteg, a staggering 63 witches were burned at the stake in just 1 year, 1562. Another small city, Oberkirch in Germany, saw 54 witches executed within 2 years, accounting for 7% of the entire city's population. In the Swiss canton of Vaud, in less than a century from 1591 to 1680, an astonishing 3,371 witches were put to death. The 1630s in Cologne witnessed the execution of 2,000 witches, while in Bordeaux in 1609, 600 witches were executed. In Scotland, the Presbyterian Church alone admitted to burning as many as 4,000 witches. It is estimated that in Europe from the 15th to the 17th century, approximately 2 million people were executed on charges of witchcraft, with the vast majority of them being women. In this witch hunt, everyone lived in constant fear, facing the risk of being accused of being a witch at any moment. Under this shroud of darkness, over 1 million women were led to the executioner's scaffold, becoming the faint glimmers of light in the darkest moments before dawn. In the 17th century, the fear and weariness among the common people regarding baseless accusations that might befall them reached its peak. More and more of the falsely accused witches began to resist, and the voices opposing the persecution of women grew louder. Especially with the rise of the European Enlightenment, people started to break free from the spiritual constraints and oppression of Catholic theology. Humanism flourished, and cognition gradually leaned toward scientific rationality. The trend of devils and witches faded out of the historical stage. In 1682, King Louis XIV of France issued a decree declaring the official cessation of persecution against witches. In faraway England, it wasn't until 1726 that the large-scale witch-hunting activities came to a halt. What truly marked the end of this bloody 3-century-long movement was the execution of an innocent woman named Anna Goldie. In 1780, Anna Goldie worked as a maid in a wealthy household and was denounced as a witch by her employer. On June 13, 1782, Anna Goldie was beheaded, making her the last woman in Europe to be executed for the crime of being a witch. Anna Goldie's death put the final red punctuation mark on this bloody movement, and the dark cloud hanging over European women finally dispersed. That wraps up our story for today. If you enjoyed the content, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and don't forget to hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next episode.